Judith, to start, can you say something about the subject of the book and why you wrote it?
Yes, I'd be glad to. There, I guess, are at least three subjects, women writers and the hero of romance. So the book kind of started with a certain discomfort I felt after 9/11, believe it or not, about the way that heroes and heroism was being talked about. There was an insistence, even a kind of desperation all around in popular culture about where are the heroes, and then especially about naming heroes, all the firemen, all the policemen, all the victims, all the people who came in to help, even from countries around. And at the same time, I'm very powerfully aware of the impulse within our society to tear down heroes. So I started really thinking and reacting quite strongly to this double-edged sense. We absolutely need heroes, but we also seem to need to tear them down. And so I got interested in that and started studying the history of heroes in literature. I've always been attracted to both teaching and writing about women writers, the fictions of women writers. You have to be careful, and I'm not sure I was as careful as I should have been in this book, not to ascribe to all women writers exactly the same kind of motifs and motives for things, but nevertheless I decided to work with women writers. And then only as I wrote chapter by chapter, summer by summer, over several years in drafts, did I realize that I was getting less interested in the history of the hero and more interested in the nature of romance, both the erotic understanding of romance and the more ancient understanding of romance as a kind of exotic thing, a wonder world, an other world. And so those were my kind of three topics that I had. I had pretty much the title of the book in mind from the beginning, although a number of emphases changed, and even some of the writers in the book that I studied changed.
Of course, your book is about heroes, specifically the hero of romance. How would you go about defining the word hero, and has this definition changed over time?
You know, there's a classical definition of the hero as a figure whose psychological makeup and development represents that of the whole culture. This is like Greek classical heroism. And so there is an element of that in what I study in the hero. How does the hero represent the cultural context in which whatever literature I write about sets him? But there are also some continuing aspects of heroes that are always interesting. One of the continuing aspects from classical times is the fact that whoever the hero is, he tends to be kind of taken out from the ordinary places of life and sent on some kind of journey or quest, either by his own power or because he is exiled, perhaps. And this journey and quest can be looked at both psychologically and in later centuries psychoanalytically in terms of personal development, and looked at in terms of cultural development. Not only what does he need to learn in order to come into his fullness, but what does his culture need to learn? And especially in the classical hero journey, how does he bring back what he's learned to the culture and help it along in its own development that way? So that's one element of the hero I was interested in. The other element of the history I was interested in, as I say, is this double-edged sword. The hero is always a man, occasionally a woman of many talents who can, hew his way through obstacles and so on, and become eventually somehow larger than life. But this very aspect of larger than lifeness can sometimes make him seem a kind of buffoon. And that can go either in terms of tragedy, like he overreaches, or in terms of comedy, like he becomes a kind of foolish person. Even someone like Hercules can, especially in modern versions of Hercules, tends to be treated as a kind of comic figure as well as heroic.
You've already written 5 books of literary criticism. How does this new book connect to the others, and in what ways does it depart from them?
Well, there are a couple of ways. One odd thing is when you've written as many books of criticism as I have, you start looking back and wondering what connects them. And rather early on, I realized that one of the odd things about my choices of what to write about is this. My dissertation was about one author, George Meredith, and what over the course of his quite long career developed in terms of what subjects was he interested in, how did he treat them, and how did he represent, not just in one novel, but over the course of all of his novels, certain changes in 19th century society, which is my major field of teaching and writing, Victorian literature. In my day, that was the kind of dissertation you were supposed to write. It was a kind of practice dissertation. Take one writer, understand that writer thoroughly. After that, you were that was your apprentice piece, and after that you were kind of adult enough to be able to do the other kind of thing, which would be to take a historical period or a theme and work it through with many allusions to many different kinds of writers and many different texts. So my next book was like that. It was about Gothic fiction in the 19th and 20th centuries and what was going on. And I realized that I wanted to kind of keep moving between these two poles. So my third novel was about a single novelist. My fourth novel was about a theme. My fifth work of criticism was about a single novelist. So at the end of that period, I was looking around for what I would want to do next in terms not of writing about a single author, but writing about a theme or a kind of period. And in looking back over all of my work, from my dissertation to the very first essay I had published as a baby assistant professor, I realized that romance, particularly as it had been held up as the early genre in fiction, which the realistic novel countered and replaced, that romance was, in that respect, a thing I had been interested in all along. So I decided to try and tackle somewhat more directly what was the good of romance? What are the controversies about romance? What are the theories of romance, and how had they changed since I first studied this topic in graduate school? So that's one way in which it's similar. It's as though I had a roadmap, and okay, which thematic thing was I going to do now? But this is, I'm recently retired. This is kind of the end-ish of my career, and I decided to do in this work of criticism something that has become a little more the norm, certainly, than it used to be in my field. I decided to write a little more personally about my acquaintance with the books I was studying through teaching them or through just personal autobiography and personal pleasure. And I was a little nervous about how publishers would feel about this, though I was aware that to a degree this was a little more common than it used to be. And the reader of this book will notice that in just about every chapter I begin with some kind of element of how I what has my personal experience been with this book, either as a teacher or as a writer or as a reader.
A critic quoted on the back cover of the book while praising the book also notes that it contains a potentially controversial argument. In what ways might this argument be considered potentially controversial?
I think the critic had probably two things in mind, at least. I haven't talked with him, so I don't really know. But I'll be looking for evidence of this in the reviews too, whether they also see some elements of that they would think are controversial. One is used to be more controversial than it is now, and that is the mix of what we might call classic English texts and popular English texts. Ever since I wrote that book on the Gothic, by the way, which was part of a movement in the 1980s to incorporate more popular texts into literary, critical, and theoretical analysis, but ever since the 80s, it has been less controversial to include both popular and classic texts. Although I must say my decision, which was a decision at the very end of this process, which took about 10 years actually, while I was kind of writing at this book, the inclusion at the end of not just two 21st century popular texts, but these particular 21st century popular texts, the Stephanie Meyer's vampire series, the Twilight series, and even worse, the 50 Shades of Grey series, which for some people is practically pornographical. That will probably resurrect the whole controversial notion of putting classic texts like Middlemarch in the same book with something like 50 Shades of Grey, and suggesting similarities as well as differences. But the more likely controversy has to do with something that came out of feminist criticism, I think, in the 1970s and 1980s, which is an argument about romance itself as it appears in fiction. There's a very strong and persuasive branch of feminist criticism which finds texts of romance, whether it's Jane Austen, classic texts, or, vampire series, finds texts that use romance to be very culturally conservative, limiting to women, constraining to women, in the respect that however independent the heroine might be of a romance as she undergoes conflicts with the hero, becomes independent and undergoes conflicts with her society. Ultimately, the purpose of romance, it would seem, is to move towards a quite normal ending with courtship, marriage, family life, and a return to order in the society of the independent woman. To take this away, my own feeling is twofold, that to put this kind of emphasis on the way romances end really underestimates and limits the actual experiences of readers who really groove on, even in Jane Austen or even the most conservative romances, who really groove on the independent and clever heroine's battle with the hero. And so I have always been in my books and essays actually trying to draw attention to the radical excitements of the middles of works of fiction rather than just to the endings and how everything is resolved. In fact, for me, I've always been very interested in finding in the resolutions of fiction, novels, whether they are romantic or realistic, certain indications that all is not as resolved as we might think. So my attitude towards all of the works that I write about, and particularly towards the female protagonist of these novels, is that the female protagonist of these novels are much more aggressive and independent and even kind of ordering the hero around than would seem the case at first blush. And second, that the pleasures of moving from conflict with the hero to engagement with the hero, once he has been kind of brought into the heroine's own orbit, are sufficient so that even endings in which the hero and heroine come together seem to me radically pleasurable. And so my argument is on behalf of romance, even popular romance, and a good deal of feminist criticism has been strong in what literary criticism calls the hermeneutic of suspicion about what romance is really up to.
You devoted chapter to Baroness Orsi's The Scarlet Pimpernel and E.M. Hull's The Sheik. I suspect if these are remembered at all today, they're best remembered for their movie versions. However, they contain distinct aristocratic heroes. How do they fit into the book?
When I think about the classical hero, and you can go back to even the Old Testament, let alone Greek and ancient narrative, about, I'd say, a third of the time, the hero comes from somewhere in the populace, but about 2/3 of the time, the hero comes from the aristocratic class. And much of the time, think about David, for instance, in the Old Testament. Much of the time, even when the hero appears to come from just the populace, it turns out that all along he was secretly the son of the Sheik or something. So one of the classic motifs of the hero is that you can justify the epic quality of the hero and his relationship to the progress of his whole society precisely because he comes from a class that has associations with the aristocracy. So that's a part of it. I'm interested in these two books, in a number of things, but one of them is the way in which, when they were published, the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, the aristocracy, in terms of culture and politics, in Western culture at least, was seen to be on the way out, while at the same time, in literature, probably precisely because politics was affirming that the aristocracy is on the way out and democracy is on the way in. At the same time as this is happening, literature, particularly popular literature, is very interested in resurrecting the aristocrat. So this chapter actually began with my interest in the Scarlet Pimpernel and the doubling of the hero. He is, on the one hand, a famous aristocrat, but he looks like one of the reasons the aristocracy is on the way out. He looks like someone who is just a dumb dandy who could take no role in the nature of his society and its development. And partly for that reason, it seems, he has developed this other secret side, which does take a role in politics. Whether you decide to call it a conservative or radical role in politics is up to you. As I say in my chapter, when I was looking around for a second text for this, I remembered the movie of the Sheik. Had not read the Sheik at all. And I thought that would make a very interesting counterweight, particularly in terms of the Englishness of the Scarlet Pimpernel and the exoticism of the Arabic Sheik. Much to my amazement, when I actually read the book, the two books fit together not as here's a doubled hero and here's a single hero, but rather the Sheik turned out to be originally the son of an English aristocrat. And the Arab he was playing is a heritage from his foster father, and he moves between these two kinds of heroisms, both of them aristocratic, with aplomb, although he is finally bested in love by the English heroine.
When I read the chapter on the Scarlet Pimpernel, a verse came into my mind, and I have no idea where I learned it, but it was a long, long time ago. And it went like this. They seek him here, they seek him there, the Frenchies seek him everywhere. Is he in heaven, is he in hell, that damned elusive Pimpernel? I'm not sure there's a question there, but would you like to comment on that?
That particular phrase, is he in heaven, is he in hell, that damned elusive Pimpernel? I originally was going to have the title of my book be That Damned Elusive Pimpernel, but as usual, the publishers of the book said, well, those who are cataloging this in libraries won't understand how to catalog it if that's the title. But anyway, there's a book a very interesting critical book which tells the whole history of the novel, the play, the movie, and the afterlife of the idea of the Scarlet Pimpernel, and particularly the idea as captured in that rhyme. And oddly enough, because it's a rhyme about a political counter-revolution, revolution and counter-revolution, there are a lot of revolutionaries who either have called themselves laughingly the Scarlet Pimpernel or have been called, either by their friends or the enemies, the Scarlet Pimpernel. So I think I hear a bit of Ireland in your voice. You could easily have received that rhyme through Irish culture's notion of the hidden worker for the independence of our society against whatever is going wrong with it at this time. And I was very surprised to hear that Nelson Mandela had been called and had delighted in hearing himself called the Scarlet Pimpernel of the South African independence movement. So it's always a useful verse.
Of course, Ayn Rand's heroes are very different to those of Orsi and Hull. They're more like, as you point out in the book, Carlyle's captains of industry. Where do Rand's heroes fit into your analysis?
You know, the very beginning of my quest to decide, after I had my theme, women writers, the hero of romance, I had to decide which novels would I write about. And what struck me immediately was not my usual beginning point, which is what in the 19th century will I start with so that I can move it into the 20th century, but rather, what are the most interesting heroes by women writers to me, myself, personally, in my life, at this moment and all through my life? And they were, and this is an extremely odd couple, Ayn Rand and her novels, and Dorothy Dunnett, the Scottish historical novelist, and her novels. They couldn't be more different. Ayn Rand's heroes are, they're not just captains of industry. They are from that 1/3 of the group of classical heroes who come right out of the populace. They're not aristocrats. They don't have any, they hardly even have parents. They come from some mysterious place in Ohio or New Jersey or someplace. And they pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. They become, either directly or indirectly, the new aristocracy, the captains of industry. they are, and Ayn Rand's novels themselves are, extremely didactic. They themselves represent a very clear, forceful, highly individualist meritocracy, let's say, not aristocracy of heroism. The talented person of strong will is the hero. We all can be sort of that kind of person, but only if we see it enlarged in a hero of this kind. And in each case, the female protagonist of the novel, who is this way herself, feels like she lives in a culture where heroism of this sort, independent, vital, highly individualistic, meritocratic, talent-based heroism, has no more role, precisely because aristocracy is out and pure democracy, and therefore mediocrity is in. So all of Ayn Rand's novels and her heroes are highly didactic. And nevertheless, I found them as a young reader and also as someone who likes to teach her novels to young readers. I found them fascinating. Both because the didacticism was clear and you could have very good discussions about what does this mean in American culture, this argument about heroism and mediocrity. And because, frankly, every time I reread one of those novels in order to teach it, I still found myself moved by it. I'm still that, 19-year-old person. Dorothy Dunnett's heroes, on the other hand, she writes historical novels in long sweeps that take 6 novels to work out. They are very complex. They are deeply flawed at some level, which you have to read all 6 novels to figure out. They are highly talented and connected to the aristocracy either in a hidden way or in an open way. But they are wary of heroism of great men, and they are extremely critical of their societies. And their nature is hidden. They keep their own nature hidden and their purposes hidden. And also Dorothy Dunnett's narrator also is the absolute opposite of the didactic. She keeps her heroes mysterious, their purposes mysterious until the very end of the novels, and she keeps her own purposes in terms of what kind of personhood she values and what kind of cultural development she values. She keeps this a kind of suspenseful secret to the end of the whole sequence of novels. So I thought they would work very well in terms of adjoining chapters about the 20th century. And the other thing that, and this is the other semi-controversial argument I have, is that in some of the novels that I treat, Wuthering Heights is kind of the central novel for this, the imagination of the heroine is what I call the virgin's imagination. That is, she looks to the hero as someone whom she can project her own idea of her own kind of human heroism into and work through. And she can kind of dominate him by the end. Whereas Dorothy Dunnett's heroes, and I think of George Eliot's heroes in this, and heroines in this kind of relationship, Dorothy Dunnett's heroes represent what I call the narrator and perhaps ultimately the author's maternal imagination of the hero. That is, the hero's job and the heroine's attempt to prod him into this job has to be not just to become kind of Superman, but to understand himself through this quest and to mitigate his flaws and to learn his responsibilities for living in a social world where not everyone is a hero, and to take responsibility, a kind of responsible mother's idea of what a good son would be in terms of the society of the future that she hopes to create.
What do you hope readers will take away from the book?
Well, as I say in my last controversial utterance in the novel, I hope the reader will take pure pleasure, both out of reading what I have to say and out of rereading either classical novels that the reader might have thought he or she already understood, but now maybe there's something more to be understood. And also, I hope they'll take more pleasure in reading or rereading popular culture literature for all that I argue can be learned from that. But I also am very interested in kind of laying out through a book that works with early 19th century novel, a later 19th century novel, a turn of the 19th to the 20th century novel, 2 20th century novels, and even 2 21st century sets of novels. I take great interest in trying to establish what in each of these particular cultural situations of these particular time frames, what use the hero of romance was being put to in order so that we can understand those cultures better in the way they differed, but also in the way they keep going back to the hero of romance as suggesting something that writers yearn to write about and make possible in the world, and readers yearn to believe is actually in the world century after century.
Judith, you've recently retired from full-time teaching at BC. Do you plan to continue teaching? Do you plan to continue writing? Do you think differently about those things now that you are indeed retired?
I do plan to teach. I've been teaching one course a year since I retired, and I hope to keep that up for a while. Writing this book, which was more about the 20th and the 21st century than I have been doing for a while, has meant that I'm more interested than I used to be in the 20th and 21st century than in the 19th century. And that has a little bit to do, I think, with the fact that inevitably, when you choose a field as a professor of literary criticism and as a teacher in a department, you choose a field that you will develop expertise in my case, the 19th century. You feel bound to keep writing about it and teaching it, and now I'm a little loosened from that now that I'm retired. So I'm likely to be working both in teaching and in writing a little more on more contemporary subjects. In fact, I've just finished an essay on the Twilight novels and the Hunger Games, which are 21st century big popular culture texts. And I'm going to teach a course next semester in Gothic fiction, which will, as usual, start in the 19th century, but end with a 21st century zombie novel, which is the 21st century's idea of the most important monster, it seems, for some reason, and I want to think about that. So it is different in a way. I'm kind of following a little more my own pleasures day by day, although I still have a very powerful instinct to look at the 19th century origins of whatever theme or historical idea I might be interested in.